Ben Riggs presents Reading D&D Aloud. Episode 40. Game designers are cool. Except for Owen KC Stephens.
Ladies and gentlemen, assembled internet hordes, welcome once again to Reading D&D Aloud. I am apparently controversial historian Ben Riggs, amateur demagogue, and I teach middle school. So, with me today is a man, a myth, a legend, the one, the only, Owen KC Stephens. How you doing, Owen?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking.
So Owen is the co-creator of the Starfinder role-playing game and the SAGA edition of Star Wars, which I did not know. So we're talking about the black book that's kind of a weird shape, that edition of Star Wars.
Yeah, that edition of Star Wars. Rodney Thompson and I were the lead designers for that. Both freelance at the time. That was just before he got hired on to basically run that line.
I mean, I'm a huge fan of the D6 Star Wars. Again, if anyone's watching this, the D6 Star Wars came out from West End Games in the late 1980s. It had a really successful run of fascinating and innovative source books. I love it, but typically people either say Saga is the best version, or if not the best version, it seems like the second best version of a Star Wars licensed role-playing game. And when I have played Star Wars Saga Edition, it's been tremendous fun.
Saga Edition had a lot of advantages in the design, and that I had been around for the original Wizards of the Coast edition. That's when I worked at Wizards from 2000 2001. So I had been present for a lot of the discussions of why things were being done the way they were in that game. But having already had the original D20 version and the revised core rulebook, and also there were people at Wizards of the Coast at the time who'd worked on the D6 version.
Yeah, Slavosek, right?
Yeah, Slavosek, for example. Slavosek worked on a bunch of Star Wars stuff. In fact, he's written a book called Designing a Galaxy that talks about the movement of information from the game line, the West End game line, to the rest of the Star Wars universe. Like Twi'leks as a species did not have a name prior to them having to be named for the game. But also like Steve Miller, who very much took me in hand about how big companies did role-playing games when I was at Wizards of the Coast. Also worked on the D6 Star Wars game, and he ran a D6 Star Wars game, which I played in when I was out there in 2000, 2001. So there was a lot to draw from. And that gave us an opportunity to say, okay, this is what worked, this is what hasn't worked, and try to sort of take the best of those ideas when working on the Saga edition.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, Bill Slavosek. I read Designing a Galaxy. It is available on Kindle for a very reasonable price. It is 4 hours of enjoyment if you are into this kind of thing. I highly recommend it. Slavosek himself is an absolutely fascinating figure. Talking to people in the industry, you hear the good, you hear the bad. You hear both about Bill Slavosek, which I personally love. I like people with a little bit of an edge on them, because it's just more fun to interview him and write about him and stuff. But wow, what do I even want to ask about Star Wars Saga Edition? So you were free. How did you get paid freelancing on that?
Per the word.
Per word, no royalties.
No, 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 no. I mean, first of all, you would never get royalties on a Wizards of the Coast game product. That might have changed. Wizards might do something differently now, but I doubt it. But also, of course, it was a licensed product. And at that point, I don't think Lucasfilm was paying royalties on their novels. I believe that is just about the time they were making a switch from a royalty system with a advance, and the advances on those very rarely paid out, to a flat fee. So none of the things that I have done for the big game companies have ever paid royalties or profit sharing, and that's one of the reasons why I launched my own company. And I understand why that is. It actually takes more money and resources for a company to pay royalties, because whatever the pay period is, someone has to go through and figure out, okay, what is owed, uh, who do we get it to, etc. So and it was work for hire, which is no surprise since it was Star Wars. The vast majority of my RPG freelance has been work for hire. But I knew that going in. I asked for a rate that, given how fast I thought I could do the work, would allow me to keep the lights on and pay the mortgage. Um, I do think lack of royalties is one of the problems in the RPG freelance universe. And this is a case where there's a little bit of do as I say, not as I do. I do pay royalties through my own company, but uh, frequently we're talking about numbers so small that we have had people get 5 cent royalty checks, right? And we do occasionally make buyout offers. One of the things that uh, our auditor slash chief financial officer slash my wife does is look at who has been making, 25 cents a year for 2 or 3 years. And she will frequently contact them and say, hey, it would be worth it to us to give you $10, which is 40 years worth of royalties at the current rate, uh, to buy out your royalty on this. And some people go for it and other people don't. We've got someone who gets royalties on the game Gingerbread Kaiju who averages 5 cents a quarter. It's not a big royalty. They had some part of the idea, but none of the actual work beyond that. And she will not be bought out. So if there is ever a Gingerbread Kaiju animated series, she will get her cut.
I uh Professor Aaron Trammell at UC Irvine had me in his class this week to talk to, I'm guessing it was 75 undergrads about D&D and TSR. And somebody asked me about the economic prospects of tabletop role-playing game designers, and I was like, it's pretty grim. But the flip side of that is that it does seem like game designers are a cultural hotspot. They're on the bleeding edge of things people are highly interested in. Um, and there's no doubt that it's cool to be a game designer. And that if you say that at a party, people's ears perk up and the hair on the back of their neck might stand up. Uh, and it's a curious and somebody came back and asked me, how do you square that circle? How can you say that game designers are just so essentially cool but can't make any money? And I don't have a great answer to that, but I guess I'll ask you, do you first of all feel cool being a game designer? Would you agree with that?
So I think this is the answer you would get from a lot of the game designers, and that is that other game designers are cool. I'm a great big nerd. Um, and I think I do genuinely tend to feel that way, right? There are a lot of people that I know who I've got to hang out with. I've gone to conventions held at Monty Cook's house, and I have hung out at the launch party for the D20 Star Wars, where we had a couple of actors from the movies and some artists and such, and that's where my best story ever comes from, the Rebel Lieutenant story. Um,
I,
all of those things were cool, but I look at myself and I am objectively not cool. I am obviously, clearly not a cool person. And I think a lot of that comes from, I've been interested in games and role playing from the time during the Satanic Panic and when Bothered About D&D was around, and I guess it may still exist, but at one time people who thought D&D was satanic were being called in to brief local police and FBI agents about the dangers of role playing. That is the time which I was most involved initially, and it's very hard for me to consider anything past that cool. That said, I do know that when I go to a convention, if I sit in a single place, people will find me and start talking to me. A phenomenon that I began to call conversations on the couch, and I had cancer. I'm in remission now, but that means I did not go to any conventions since 2020. Uh, early 2020, and there are people that have pinged me and said, "Hey, we missed seeing you there. Getting to hang out with you like at Gen Con in the lobby of the Omni Hotel was one of the things we enjoyed looking forward to." So I think there is an element of coolness to it. I think it's going to vary wildly, both by the person who is being considered cool and who is considering them cool. There are a lot of people I love getting to hang out with and ask questions of, and you're doing a podcast. Clearly, someone cares about these things. Uh, but mostly, I think there's this sense of it being cool because games are about getting together and having a good time. It's about creating a framework for fun. I don't think you can actually create the fun. I think the players bring that with them, but having a set of curated ideas for them to think about is cool. And I think most people have some sort of memory of a time which they were playing a game and they had a good time. And the idea of being part of creating that uh, seems at least interesting.
Wow. Um, so I'm going to mention this again. I teach seventh and eighth grade, and I feel like D&D has replaced rock and roll to a degree, or I shouldn't say replaced. Uh, it's akin to what rock and roll was when we were younger, where it's a thing that like if you're not doing it, you're interested in it, and you at least would have a passing knowledge of it. Um, like the all the kids are either into D&D or would like to be into D&D. Like 90%. And last last episode, Mike Merles was like, I don't think D&D is cool anymore. I think the OGL killed the coolness of D&D, and it took.
Ah,
I thought about that for a while, and I was
pshaw.
like, so you go ahead, you go ahead and pshaw, and then I'll pshaw.
So first of all, the OGL led to an explosion of companies and ideas and styles, which I believe directly led to the creation of things like Critical Role and
Oh, I'm
Stranger
sorry.
Things.
The OGL scandal killed D&D. Sorry.
Oh, okay. That's I will still pshaw that, but it's not nearly as big a pshaw. The OGL scandal turned a lot of people off the company, and a lot of people can't separate the company from the game. It's easy for me to separate the company from the game because I've worked for that company and I know how very, very different they are. But also, of course, I've got, let's see, I am looking right now here in my game room at 30 linear feet of D&D book spines on a bookcase. So I don't need anything from the company if I happen to want to play D&D. I might want stuff, but I don't need anything. And I've had more than one business person tell me that that's actually the terrible thing about D&D, that once you've got a couple of books, you don't need anything else. But you are still seeing people go berserk over whatever the new release for D&D is. I think it took some of the shine off, but I think D&D remains, there aren't many role-playing games that have gotten movies. There's only one role-playing game that's gotten a movie with Chris Pine in it. Um, that's what the fifth D&D movie, fourth D&D movie, something like that, depending on whether you want to count things that weren't ever theatrically released.
Or animated.
Right, sure. And yeah, Mutant Chronicles got a movie, but no one knows about it. So I think it's safe to say that that remains the 600-pound juggernaut of the industry, and it remains the cultural touch point, right? If I am talking to uh, someone from labor and statistics, right, who's trying to figure out how many people are employed in a given area, they're doing a survey. They're like, "What do you do for a living?" "Oh, well, I write role playing games and role playing game supplements." "Oh, what's a role playing game? You heard of D&D?" "Oh yeah, no, they know what D&D is." If I say, "Have you heard of Call of Cthulhu or Pathfinder or GURPS?" 90% of them will still have no idea what I'm talking about. So it everything, even if it's not D&D, even if people don't like D&D, they tend to compare everything to D&D. So it is the weight and measure standard of English language role playing games.
Yeah, if I could, at the time I was just so interested in listening. I'm like, oh, Mike Merles thinks D&D isn't cool. Having thought about it for a week, I would say I think D&D in this moment was saved by the fact that it is both a product and a practice, and the practice of D&D, like people getting together and having a good time, was not really impacted by the OGL scandal. And again, like the 12-year-olds didn't know about it and don't know about it now, and uh, it really did activate a lot of us grognards and a lot of us that were older. But even when I would go into the faculty lounge and talk to people under 30 about it, a lot of them were kind of like, well, they're changing the licensing. What's anyone going to do about it? I'm just going to keep playing D&D. You don't, everyone is cool but you. Um, I've definitely encountered some of that feeling in my life. Uh, that kind, do you think it's imposter syndrome? Is that the way you would think about it?
I think imposter syndrome is a big part of it. I literally once sat at a convention with three or four other game industry professionals, and one of them said, I've got a seminar on imposter syndrome in a few minutes. I'm not qualified to talk about imposter syndrome, which I think is the most perfect summation of imposter syndrome I've ever heard. Yeah, I think that's some of it, but also, and this goes back to the OGL scandal a little bit. We see how our sausage gets made. We don't see how all the other sausages get made necessarily. So if I'm looking at some other game designer's book, I can ooh and ah over the great art that got put in there and be impressed by the clever turns of phrase and wonder at the new game mechanic that ties in perfectly to the theme of that. I don't get to see the late nights and the fact that they had, 5 chapters they wanted to put in and didn't have room for, and the piece of art that was supposed to be even more awesome and got cut. All of that remains invisible. And the invisible stuff impacts those of us that see it so much more than the game playing public. Even when the OGL scandal was a huge scandal, I had friends who didn't know it was happening because they're not talking to any game creator whatsoever, right? Unless they happen to talk to me about it. If you are going and buying your game products online somewhere, be that Drive-Thru RPG or Amazon or some game stores online shop, which a lot of independent game stores have online places to purchase. No one was putting up an electronic notice warning you are about to buy a product that is produced by a company that is engaged in some OGL scandalness. They just don't know. And with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people playing these games, the percentage of them that were even aware there was a scandal is tiny. And it's everybody who makes games, right? You didn't have to be involved in the OGL at all. You knew someone who knew someone. But you didn't even have to be making games, right? If you were someone who was doing podcasts or actual plays or any of that, that news got to you. But that didn't impact people who are just buying books and playing games. If you were doing it at a game store, you might have heard about it because the people who work at the game store might well be up on that. But not all of them and not all the time. And another problem I think that the RPG industry is wrestling with is that the best game stores, we've got one here not far from my house, Game HQ, which has, an entire room the size of my house dedicated to tables for people to play games at. And that's great. But that increases their cost. Whereas if I decide to buy a book off Amazon, Amazon doesn't have to pay for any of that. So the best game stores aren't the cheapest. And we as Americans tend to enjoy things that don't cost much. But that's also a place where you're going to pick up your industry scuttlebutt if you are not connected somehow to an insider.
I wish there was a better way that all game designers could get rich. Um, I don't think royalties hurt. I think they help. And I think it's a shame that the companies best in a position to pay them don't. Um, man, like, you know, they had to sell at least 500,000 copies of that 2024 Player's Handbook, right? Um, they kept qualifying the sales, but let's assume they sold 500,000. Like, you give a quarter per copy to Crawford Perkins and a few other people, and that makes a big difference.
Well, and Crawford and Perkins and a few other people are actually being paid six-figure salaries, or were at the time, by Wizards of the Coast with full benefits. Now, they're having to live in Seattle, which is horrifically expensive, but they're still doing okay. Um, and while it's true that Wizards is the most able to pay royalties, they're also the one that is a part of a publicly owned company where decisions are getting made about how to maximize uh, shareholder benefit, and the amount of money D&D makes pales in comparison to so many other things they have, that there's a real risk at any given moment that they'll go, you know what, maybe D&D isn't worth it. Or maybe D&D is worth it, but just for the movies. We just won't make games anymore. Or we'll keep one board, we'll keep D&D Monopoly in stock so that people can see it, since Hasbro owns Monopoly anyway. Um, so the very thing that makes them so able to be the 600-pound gorilla in the industry means that there's a real risk at any given moment that they could go, no matter how much we're making, it's not worth it compared to what we make on other things.
I keep hearing rumors that they're going to stop making uh D&D, but by which I mean like not just the books, but like they're going to license it to another company or sell it off in some way, shape, or form. And again, maybe it's all just rumor, right? Because like for the exact reason you just laid out of like it's not a $1 billion brand, and they want it to be a $1 billion brand. Um, and obviously they're working on a virtual tabletop that they hope will make it into a $1 billion brand. But I just, I'm skeptical.
Well,
Um,
and if they decided not to make it anymore, I don't believe that they would license it or sell it. I believe they would stick the brand in their vault until someone came along and had an idea how to monetize it better. I I don't know the last time Hasbro sold a brand. That's not what they do, right? If it's not worth pouring money into, if we can't make enough money on it directly, we certainly can't make enough money selling it or licensing it. The only way that thing could ever, in my opinion, that D&D could be bought by someone would be if some probably billionaire happened to love D&D so much that they would pay way more than it's worth just to own it. And fans being fans, I'm not saying that's impossible, but it's sure unlikely.
all right, well, it's called Reading D&D Aloud, and we haven't read anything yet. The conversation just got rolling. I was so fascinated by the Saga edition of Star Wars. Um, so you are here, and we're going to discuss Freeport. Um, for anyone who doesn't know, what would you say the Freeport is conceptually?
Conceptually, Freeport is well, I mean, it's the city of adventure. It is a pirate city in a fantasy setting that happens to include icky elder horror things like from Lovecraft. It is also something that was very firmly rooted in the OGL movement of 3.0 D&D. It was available at the same Gen Con that the 3.0 Player's Handbook for D&D was, and has since that time bapped about in a few different game systems. And now Green Ronin has it in their own adventure game engine, which was created by Green Ronin for uh, Dragon Age role-playing game. But they have now moved Freeport as part of Fantasy Age into that system. Uh, and my main connection to it was first as the developer for the 544 page, I think, Pathfinder First Edition of Freeport, which is a huge hardback. It's definitely one of the biggest city books ever. It's not Tollus big, but it's big. Um, and then for a while, I was the uh, age developer at Green Ronin, and so I was weaving it into the second edition Fantasy Age rulebook.
Again, talking to these kids at UC Irvine, one of them was like, "So when it comes to lore, like how much lore do you think you should have in a splat book? Should it be a lot?" And I gave him a pretty minimal answer. I had Barkeep on the Borderlands
Uh-huh.
conveniently placed, and I was like, it's like really they set up a whole adventure in 2 pages,
Yep.
and I think that's beautiful. And I have Talentless right behind me here. And again, these kids are. I don't think there's anyone over the age of 25 in that classroom. so they don't remember the 90s. They don't really remember 3.0 or 3.5. So I pulled Towelist out, and the expressions on the kids' faces as they see this phone book-sized hardcover role-playing game supplement come out was pretty amusing to me. Um, and it is interesting to think about. I guess I'll talk about the first mover advantage later, but so I'm going to read the preface from the Freeport Trilogy 5-year anniversary edition because there were three adventures that got things rolling. They were bound together 5 years later, and Chris Pramus wrote a preface, and I'm going to read that aloud. But feel free to interrupt me at any point. Okay?
All right.
All right. Welcome to the Freeport Trilogy 5-year anniversary edition. This book is a great starting point for a new campaign and can be used in conjunction with nearly any fantasy setting. Player characters that play through all the adventures will rise from low to mid-level and be ready for even greater challenges in Freeport and the wider world. The Freeport Trilogy, as the name indicates, was originally released in 3 parts in 2000 and 2001 under the 3.0 rules. The first adventure in the trilogy, Death in Freeport, was at the very epicenter of the D20 explosion and was released at Gen Con 2000 on the same day as the new edition of D&D. This makes Freeport the oldest 3rd edition campaign setting and one of the few that has received constant support over the past 5 years. These products range from further adventures like Tales of Freeport and Black Sails over Freeport to source books like Denizens of Freeport and Creatures of Freeport to what became the core book of a whole line, Freeport, the City of Adventure. And that was what you worked on?
Uh, so it was a 3.0 and then 3.5 product. And what I worked on was the decision was made. There was a big Kickstarter for it to compile a whole bunch of the information about it for Pathfinder First Edition.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Then I will continue reading since I'm wrong. By the summer of 2003, though, Freeport had a couple of problems. First, the original modules had long been out of print. People just getting into Freeport felt like they wanted to start at the beginning, but the adventures were harder and harder to find.
And let me
Second, go
let
ahead,
me go
sorry.
ahead and leap in there. One of the things that people kind of aren't used to nowadays is that there was a time where if it was not in print, you couldn't get it. Most companies are now selling PDFs at least of older stuff.
Eternally.
Right. Yeah. And it may be, Wizards doesn't mostly do that, but the really older stuff they actually make PDFs of, just not their current stuff. Paizo for a long time only sold PDFs on their own store. Now there's some stuff that they sell elsewhere, but not only were these things not available, but the files weren't always kept. More than once, when I have been in conversations with company about, hey, why don't we bring back X? One of the answers is we don't have any of the electronic files anymore. They took up too much space, or we switched them over so many times that we don't have compatible programs for them anymore. And once or twice, I've been part of projects designed to bring things back by taking an old printed version, taking the staples out of it, scanning it, and using optical character recognition to get the text back. And that drives the price point of recreating one of these things way up because obviously it's a slow, annoying process. So at the time when this book came out in 05, I don't believe there were any Freeport PDFs available. So if you were interested in this line, and we're only talking about a few years since it came out, right? If you couldn't buy it, you couldn't get it. And people ended up, looking at places like Second Use and back of the bin piles of used games that have been turned in someplace. So this is a way in which the industry has changed quite a bit, even just since this book came out.
You know, when I was going through my AD&D phase, Ravenloft was my setting of choice. And I knew that there was I6 Adventure, the I6 Adventure Ravenloft.
Uh-huh.
I knew that it was fantastic, but I'd never seen it or read it. And I 14-year-old me had no idea how to even go about acquiring it. I'm from Milwaukee. I probably could have poured through some dealer at Gen Con and maybe found it, but it just seemed like, well, so much nonsense to go and do that. I just didn't bother. I didn't read that. I don't think I read I6 Ravenloft until like 2011. When I did, I was like, "Holy crap, this is amazing!" I can see why they were like, "Let's expand on this. Let's do a whole setting around this thing." But as awful as it could be to be denied information that we wanted instantaneously, it certainly did make hunting things down a real joy back in the day, and that is kind of gone now.
I mean, it's just that you have to hunt older stuff now, right? My very first Dragon article was in Dragon Magazine number 251. And the reason that that is important and relevant is that the D&D CD archive goes from issue 1 to issue 250. So my very first article is in the very first Dragon that you cannot get an electronic copy of, at least legally. Um, so if I want those articles, I have to have physical copies of those magazines. And one of the things that happens to me every few months is frequently someone I've known for years, will ping me and be like, "You wrote the dwarf name generator in whatever episode," and I'm like, "Yeah, I did that." And they're like, "I had no idea," because of course no one's paying attention for the most part to who's writing articles in Dragon magazine in the 90s. Um, but those are still around, and when collectors find them, sometimes those people are collectors who know me personally quite well and just have no idea what I did before like 2010.
Whew. So, but before I start rambling off about Conan comics, and how the Kurt Busiek run is now really hard to get, I'm going to go back to reading about Freeport because I feel like if I start talking about comics, we've really ventured off the beaten path. So, the adventures were harder and harder to find. Second, the 3.5 revision of the core rules made all the 3.0 books in the series out of date, so a straight reprint was out of the question. In 2004, we began the process of updating the trilogy to the new rules. Tim Emmerich revised the adventures one by one, and we released them individually as PDFs to make them available again. That laid the groundwork for the book you hold in your hands. We took the original three adventures of the trilogy, Death in Freeport, Terror in Freeport, and Madness in Freeport, and then added two interludes for even more action. One of those interludes, Holiday in the Sun, was previously available on www.greenronin.com, and the second, Thieves and Liars, was written specifically for this book. We also commissioned new maps and art so we could make the 5-year anniversary edition a true premium product. I am delighted to see this material back in print again. It dates back to the beginning of Green Ronin, and it was Freeport that put us on the RPG map. The company has grown and changed quite a bit since then. In 2000, Green Ronin was two of us, myself and Nicole Lindroos. Is it Lindroos?
Lingers.
Lindroos. And Nicole Lindroos working part-time nights and weekends. It took us 7 months to complete and publish the original modules of the Freeport trilogy. 5 years later, Green Ronin employs 7 full-time staffers, and we publish 2 to 3 times as much material as the entire trilogy every month. Over the years, we've published over 75 books, launched multiple games, licensed fantasy classics like Black Company and Thieves World, won over 20 awards for quality, and designed and developed the new edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. None of that would have been possible without Freeport, and the City of Adventure will always have a special place at Green Ronin for that reason. Best of all, we aren't done with Freeport yet. Once again, the Freeport trilogy is just the beginning. 2006 will see a full-scale relaunch of the setting. That starts with Crisis in Freeport, a sequel to the trilogy that finally resolves the succession crisis. So stay with us for more Freeport action. The City of Adventure is just getting started. And in addition to the setting being really, really cool, I just feel like Freeport and Green Ronin is such a good example of first mover advantage. Um, I want to say at 2000 Gen Con, other than the player's handbook, there was Death in Freeport, A Time to Kill by John Tynes, and I think maybe White Wolf had the Creature Codex out.
White Wolf
Uh,
had the Creature Codex out. Yeah.
and those were the only three things that you could buy to play 3.0 with. And Atlas, which published A Time to Kill, they had a huge 3.0 3.5 line that stretched on for years, and Green Ronin popped into existence simply because the adventures sold so well. And you know, you go to Gen Con today, and Chris Pramus and Nicole Lindroos are still there, still selling books, and you know, it probably wouldn't have happened if he had not been first out the gate. It would have got like how many dozens of adventures were probably hundreds of adventures were published by third-party publishers for 3.0. And again, Death in Freeport is also very, very good, but the fact that it was first is huge.
Well, and there's another really important difference between Green Ronin and a lot of the companies that popped up in the year after the OGL launch, and that is that Chris and Nicole are experienced veteran game industry professionals. So many companies that popped up in that first 2 or 3 years were basically four friends who are were playing in their garage and then decided to run a company from their garage. And during the D20 boom, that was easy. Then you started to have things like D20 busts, and there were times where Green Ronin could not survive on D20 content. That is, Mutants and Masterminds was a brilliant move of theirs that was not, they weren't even the first people to do a D20 superhero game. There was one that was coming out that first year that was being passed around the Wizards of the Coast offices, and it was terrible. So in that case, so terrible, I don't remember the name of it. In that case, the important thing is that Mutants and Masterminds was good, and it is now in its third edition and continues to have products come out regularly. Uh, they did Warhammer, so they were trusted to do, I think it was at the time, third edition Warhammer role playing, and that was an enormous move beyond D20. So definitely, they got a nice launch at the time, but it's also important to remember that when 3.5 was announced, that was the beginning of the D20 bust, and a lot of companies ceased to exist, regardless of how big they were at the time. And it's people like Green Ronin and, for that matter, Mongoose, who were capable of pivoting and doing other big stuff that made those companies successful and popular. Uh, it's not the fact that they did Thieves World, which I worked on with Green Ronin, or Black Company, which I worked on with Green Ronin. Those books aren't what caused Green Ronin to still be here 25 years later. They're great books, but they did not carve new fans in numbers out of the sea of people who wanted to just play D&D the way that the Dragon Age book did and Warhammer did and Mutants and Masterminds did. The fact that there is a modern age game and a fantasy age game, and they've got Cthulhu Awakens now, that is from both some really good design work by some great designers, Joe Carricker and Nicole and Crystal Frazier and Chris himself, and a bunch of other people, Alex. But also the fact that they were experienced game industry professionals and they could look at what the risks were, form business plans, get through downturns in the industry. That is why there is still a Green Ronin today.
Like I running a business is really, really hard.
Yeah.
I I have but dipped my toes in those waters, and I am like, oh, this is a lot of math. God.
This isn't fun in gaming. This is just a bunch of math and legal requirements.
Yeah. Um, and yet it certainly seems like if you are interested in being a game designer, uh, starting out on your own and just making stuff seems to be the way to go about it. Unless you disagree, but it seems like if you were starting out today, your goal you don't go to Wizards of the Coast and give them a resume. You don't go to Chaosium and give them a resume. You make some stuff and then hope that the work comes. Would you agree with that?
I think that's one of the routes. It is super hard for me to speak authoritatively on how you get started in the tabletop game industry now because I got started in the 90s, right? I sent a self-addressed stamped envelope to TSR for the writer's guidelines for Dragon magazine. That is how I got started. And then after that, Steve Jackson Games Pyramid. And those magazines, that niche of magazines basically don't exist now. Um, when Dave Gross, who's the editor of Dragon magazine, gave me the email address to Dragon for subscriptions so I didn't have to physically type them and fold them up and mail them anymore, that was a big step forward in my career. And in fact, it was in, I think, 99, just before I interviewed for the first time at Wizards of the Coast. But I think there are a lot of ways you can get started now. So there are, for example, opportunities at Paizo. They do a lot of stuff for their organized play. And they frequently, if you show that you've got some chops, there's a decent chance that they might say, okay, we've got a book coming out. You have shown that you understand second edition Pathfinder. We will assign you 5 spells, something small just to get you started. I also think there are a fair number of people who start with blogs, Patreons, Substacks, and Medium and such that aren't so much getting into a business end of things as they are sort of a paid sideline. You can make money on a Patreon, but you can also just put out content and get feedback on that content and have something to point people to when you do want to try and get work from one of the bigger companies. And then there are the little tiny companies like my own Rogue Genius Games. There are bigger ones too, like Legendary, and then sort of the size, I think, between Legendary and Paizo, like Cobalt. So there are these steps of company sizes. There are a fair number of people who do now or have in the past few years worked at Paizo, whose early days were writing for me at Rogue Genius. Michael Sayer, I did what I believe was his very first product, which was just a list of bravery feats. It was feats for one class feature for one class for first edition Pathfinder. But it proved he could put together a manuscript, that he could hit a deadline, that he understood the rules, that he understood the formatting. And that meant that later when he wanted to write things for Paizo before he worked there, he could say, I've got this product, so I've proven I can do this. You can look at the quality. And as it happens, when he applied for a job there, I was working there on Starfinder. So the people that were considering hiring him could come to me and say, hey, Michael Sayer's applying for a job. He worked for you. Do you have anything to say about him? And I had purely nice, glowing things to say. From my point of view, famously, I had said one year when I was at Paizo, the first or second year there, that one of the greatest networking opportunities I had found was buying professionals a drink when they are at a bar at a convention. And I admit that is problematic as heck as advice. But I had found that I had literally been missing opportunities because I did not go drinking with people at Gen Con. So I ended up changing that policy and just ordering club soda. And as a multi-100-pound 6-foot-tall cis white male, I'm not usually worried about my safety. So I am well aware that there are people who are taking a much bigger risk doing that kind of thing. And I'm not necessarily recommending it. I'm just saying it has been a step forward. Well, one year, Luis Loza stepped up to me at a PaizoCon and said, hey, Owen, you said we should buy people drinks. Can I buy you a drink? And then by the next PaizoCon, he was an employee of Paizo. That's not because he bought me a drink. It's because Luis Loza was listening to people's advice, writing, getting material out there. He had hustle, putting himself into the industry. My general advice, which I got from a tiny blue cloth book published in the 1930s called How to Get a Job, my advice has always been put your name in front of people who can hire or pass out work in a positive context as often as you can. And the industry changes so fast that how you do that, I think, switches. but the core concept of put your name, and preferably recognizably your name, somewhere where these people will see it, however that is. If you can, go to online conventions and there's a question and answer, ask intelligent questions with your name attached to it. If you can put things out on a blog, if you can take small pieces of work for small companies and work your way up. I still see people doing that. But the other thing I do see sometimes is someone simply puts out a 96-page role-playing game, as far as I can tell, out of nowhere, and suddenly everyone knows who they are. So I don't think there's one right way at this point.
Yeah, that like the ability of some people to put out an amazing short game that just knocks everyone's socks off. It does seem like that is one of the wondrous things about the tabletop role-playing game space. Do you have a favorite designer, like someone whose work, like if you find out that they're putting something out, you're like, well, I just have to pick it up because it's from this person?
I have a bunch. Crystal Frazier is very, very much near the top of my list. She is currently working at Wizards and therefore not putting out non-Wizard stuff. But I'm a huge fan of everything she does. Rob Schwalb. I think Schwalb is one of the greatest tabletop designers currently alive. Steve Kenson absolutely hits that list. I have said more than once that Steve is who I want to be when I grow up. Which, some of that is the he's cool and I'm not effect. And Steve, these are also all great people. I mean, Steve and Crystal and Schwab are all people that I've gotten to hang out with, and I'm a big fan of them as people on top of everything else. And then Chris Pramus, I think, is undervalued as a game designer, and I think some of that is because he does run his own company, so he's frequently having to do president of Green Ronin work instead of getting to do fun game design work. But when you look at, like, he created the core adventure game engine, and that engine is just brilliant. And some of the best parts of it link back to Dragon Fist, a second edition D&D supplement that was only ever available electronically, that he created in the 90s or early aughts, that shows some of the seeds that I think the adventure game engine really grew to full blossom.
What's sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go.
What's particularly great about the adventure game engine?
So the adventure game engine, its core conceit, the thing I love about it the most, is that you use 3 6-sided dice to generate your number that you add modifiers to, just like people are familiar with. And then one of those 3 dice needs to be discernible as different from the other 2. And anytime you roll doubles, you earn stunt points equal to the value of that 3rd die. And those stunt points can be used for special maneuvers or special events or even sometimes special happenstance. And in the 2nd edition Fantasy Age, there are very specifically, there are combat stunts, there are exploration stunts, there are social stunts, and then there are stunts that individual classes can pick up, or stunts can be tied to a layer. So a monster might have stunts it can pull off when it's in its home, for example. And these can be set up as things that require circumstances to go right to pull off. But instead of requiring a critical hit the way you would on a 20 on a D20, you could potentially just barely succeed. But if you needed a 11 to succeed, and you got an 11 with a 6 on your stunt die and then a 3 and a 2, you just barely succeed, but you got 6 stunt points. So you can do a big, impressive stunt or a series of little stunts, your stunt points. And it means that you avoid, even if you're playing 2 fighters banging away at each other toe to toe, and that's all that's happening, you avoid having the same boring set of options be your best bet with every move. As combat goes, the combat is going to shift and change based on what stunts do you have available to you and how many stunt points do you earn. And then that system has been drawn out into exploration. So you might well have an exploration stunt where you have found a hidden river of water so that you have less resource you have to burn as you're exploring this area. Same with social stunts, right? You can be trying to make checks for diplomacy or threatening or anything, but what actually happens can be impacted by whether or not you rolled up stunt points. I personally think one of the most important aspects of a fun game is a game that gives you periodic, interesting options. So if you are playing a game where either on purpose or by accident, your character ends up having one best move 90% of the time, I at least end up getting bored because there's no decision making. Okay, I've got this one incredibly powerful ability. Or worse, on the flip side of things, oh, we're here I'm playing a combat machine and we're in a social encounter. There is nothing I can do except try to loom behind someone and be threatening, and it's not going to be particularly effective. The stunt point randomizer makes the game more interactive and less predictable while still making it useful to be good at things you're good at and have what you have built as your character being an important part of success. It is why I agreed to be the Fantasy Age developer when I was offered that job 7 or 8 years, a number of years ago now. And I was sad when I had to leave, but I did. And I still think it is one of the greatest games that is still prepped to explode even more than it has. It's the engine behind Fantasy Age, it's obviously, and Modern Age, but it's also the engine behind the Expanse role-playing game, which is extremely popular with sci-fi fans and Expanse fans. And it's something that can be adapted by changing out the stunts to a wide range of genres and styles and even settings.
Do you have a favorite expression of the system?
Well, yeah, Fantasy Age Second Edition, but I was the developer for most of that, so it's probably no shock, right? There are specific things that I wanted to see from the first Fantasy Age that got in there, and I'm not the person that took that over the finish line. I worked on the development for a good chunk of the middle, and I wrote chunks of it, but I left as developer prior to that actually going to print because I was taking too long. Honestly, I needed to get done. And for various reasons, I wasn't able to be the person to get it done. So Ian took over and has done a brilliant job with the whole series since. But that is currently my favorite expression of the system. After that, it's probably Modern Age, especially if you've got a game master who's willing to get in there and create their own setting and tune some of the stunts and some of the classes and some of the advanced classes and such to their specific setting. It can do everything from and has rules in the rule book for changing everything from really gritty, realistic modern adventures all the way to Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Supernatural and Highlander and The Crow. All of that stuff could easily be done in that.
So you mentioned that your in cancer's in remission. Is that right?
Yes. As of last September, I was fighting cancer for I actually apparently had cancer starting in 2015, but we didn't catch it until 2023 early. And I fought it all through 2023 and through most of 24. And we ended up having to go to radiation. And that did, in fact, get it. Now I am on the process of recovering from the radiation, which one of the things I learned that I didn't know is that, one, I did not know you could get so much radiation that you can't safely ever have radiation treatment in that part of your body again. My oncologist referred to it as a definitive dose of radiation.
Huh.
I didn't know that you might do radiation with chemo, which is what we did. They cranked me up to the highest level of chemo I'd ever been on during the 2 months of radiation treatment. And then the radiation, you do your best to focus it on just the cancer, but radiation radiates, hence the name. And so I'm much better than I was when we were done in September. And the cancer still appears to be in remission, but I'm not fully recovered from that yet. And then there's the financial recovery, which that is going to take probably even longer because welcome to American healthcare.
So is there a way that First of all, what work of yours would you recommend people check out?
I mean that honestly, that depends very much on what they're into. Right in the moment, I will take this moment to advertise that I've got a backer kit going uh, for my first uh, professional card game, which is called Trump Card, which is a political cartoon with rules. We make the joke that you're only allowed to have four cards at a time because it's a game of small hands. Uh, that slow giggling noise you're making is exactly what we're going for. And you can go to tinyurl.com/cardgametrump, and that'll take you to the backer kit, where we have some of the action cards. The rules were you guys weren't supposed to fact check. And you can see the core play with superlative cards. It's a bluffing game. You play a card and you say, this is the highest valued tower card anyone has. No one is going to have a better tower card than this. This is the best tower card. And then once you play that card, everyone has to follow suit and claim that they've got the best card, and they're all played face down. Uh, and obviously, some of you are wrong and some of you are lying. You might not even have a tower card with only four cards in your hands. So, we call it the game of lying liars and the lies they lie about. And a political cartoon, given cards and rules, is the best way I know to describe that game.
That's really funny.
Thank you.
And good. If people would like to help out with your medical debt situation, how can they do that?
I've got a GoFundMe. If you are a simply search for things on the internet, you can go to you can search for help Owen KC Stephens pay off cancer bills. But it is GoFundMe.com help-Owen-KC-Stephens-fight-cancer.
I'll put a link in the show notes too.
Okay.
Wow.
And I think there are like 4 tiny URLs that point to that because people keep making them, and I keep forgetting to have them ready when I'm doing an interview or something. So,
So, I guess last pair of questions. What work of Crystal Frazier's and was it Steve Kenson?
yeah. Well,
what work of theirs would you recommend, Crystal and
Schwab.
Steve?
I'm going to stick Schwab in there first.
That is unfair of me to ditch Rob Schwab because please.
Schwab's done Shadow of the Weird Wizard. If you want a brilliantly condensed, fast, balanced, interesting fantasy role-playing game, I recommend Shadow of the Weird Wizard. Schwab Entertainment. Schwab puts out an amazing amount of content. He's the hardest working person in the game industry, I think. If you want your fantasy with more curd stomping and stains, you can get Shadow of the Demon Lord instead. It's basically the same game engine, but Shadow of the Demon Lord is very much more grunge, unpleasant fantasy where if your character walks out of it missing 3 fingers, that's a good day. But all of Schwab Entertainment stuff, but Shadow of the Weird Wizard would be my number one recommendation. Crystal has done a bunch of stuff for Mutants and Masterminds. They've got a Mutants and Masterminds, I think it's called the Beginner's Handbook, but it is a introductory set for M&M. And I had the advantage of getting to see, when I was living out in Seattle, Crystal was kind enough to run a Mutants and Masterminds game at my apartment for some game designers. And I saw her take that book and go from people that had never played the system to everyone has a character and we're ready for our first adventure in 30 minutes, which is just spectacularly fast. And it's a brilliantly designed book. So I heartily recommend everyone pick it up. She also does comics. I recommend looking for Crystal Frazier comics, and I'm not going to give out any titles at the moment. Just she's done some. They're great. Go pick them up. Steve has also done some great stuff with Mutants and Masterminds, but for him, I recommend picking up Icons. Steve is responsible for Mutants and Masterminds being as good a game it is, and Icons is the game he created to do the things that M&M doesn't necessarily handle well. And that's not to say that M&M is a bad system. Every game has something it focuses on, some level of granularity, some amount of action, whatever. And Steve is really a scholar of what comics and comic book like characters do. He has analyzed the action in popular cartoons, for example. For a while, he was analyzing everything that happened in Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. So I recommend that you go pick up the Icons book. I think anyone who likes superhero action role playing should look at that book. And if you have tried other games and find that they are not giving you what you want in a crunch of rules to action ratio, then Icons might in fact be exactly the answer you're looking for.
Wow. All right. Well, that was all amazing, Owen. I'm gonna outro and then we'll say goodbye. Is that okay?
Yeah, great.
So, we have a Patreon. Surprise, surprise. Who could have expected a Patreon associated with the podcast? Radical new marketing strategies right here. Uh, for a mere $3 a month, you get access to our Discord. On that Discord, I am slowly digitizing my entire TTRPG document library. If you want to know how much TSR grossed in 1995, if you want to know how much they made in hardback books and how much they made in novels. The last few things I digitized were the 1994, 1995, and 1996 documents explaining exactly how much TSR grossed in every area. I'm not sure what I'm going to start digitizing after that. Maybe sales numbers. Maybe I'll just start going through sales numbers and digitizing that. But I definitely have enough documents to last a few years. I also have special episodes that I post just for Patreon subscribers. I am slowly reading the Dungeon Master's Guide Aloud with Dr. Scott Bruner. I have also scheduled an hour with Ken Hite and Sandy Peterson, where we will be discussing Call of Cthulhu. I'll be recording that in February and dropping it in February, and that will only be available for Patreon subscribers, but it's not up yet. But it will be by the end of February. So, hey, if you think that sounds cool, go subscribe. All of that for less than the price of a cup of coffee. In these inflationary times, it is a deal that cannot be beat. And
Someday someone has to get Ken Hite on a podcast and make him talk about Toon.
oh, was he involved in that?
Not that I know of. But if you get Ken Hite, people always talk about Call of Cthulhu. And I just or Ken and Robin talk about stuff, but I'm just saying he's got to know about the game, right? Someday someone needs to bring it on there and ask him, how do you do Toon in the setting of Chicago?
All right. Well, you heard it here first, folks. I should get Ken Hyde to talk about that. If you think that's fun, join the Patreon and tell me on Discord.
And while Ben's laughing, I also have a Patreon. It's Patreon Owen KC Stephens.
And what do you post on your Patreon?
I post a bunch of stuff right at the moment. I had a request from one of my patrons to do horrifically overpowered class features for Pathfinder First Edition character classes. And that got a huge positive response. One of the early books I did for Pathfinder First Edition through Rogue Genius Games was horrifically overpowered feats, which has the tagline, "Don't use these rules ever." They are specifically they are too powerful for use. There's no legitimate function for them in anybody's Pathfinder game, and they're one of our best-selling lines. And we did like 6 follow-up PDFs. And I mentioned at one point that class features could theoretically be done, and I had some paying patrons say, "Oh, we really want that." So that's what I'm doing at the moment. But I also talk about news in the industry. I'll talk about my take on development and design, what's going on in the industry. I will tease game mechanic analysis. I do a lot of discussion of how I handle the job as game developer. And I think there's something like 360 posts that you can go through if you sign on. So there's a lot of content there. And much like yours, our base level is $3 a month.
Woohoo! You know, I'm interested to see. So my theory is keep the number low and just make it so good that everyone feels like it's such a good value they have to subscribe. We'll see if that works out in the long run or not, but that is my theory of the case for the way I'm running this, and time will prove me right or wrong. I hope it's been working out well for you.
Yeah, I've been running it since 2016, and it's one of my primary sources of game income, to be honest.
Nice, cool. Well, Owen, it was such a delight to talk to you. I'll have to have you on again sometime. I really appreciate it, and I hope everything continues to go well with your health.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. I had a lot of fun.